mean, I think the reason behind our inclusion of third-party funding provisions in the Act was to meet, one, an international growing trend. It was clearly a provision that was internationally accepted, that certain arbitration claimants required financial support to actually bring their claim to remedy. So people often refer to access to justice as one of the reasons behind a third-party funding arrangement in a statutory provision. And I think that certainly propelled us. But I like to think of access to justice in the arbitration context as more like an access to remedy, because whether it is just or not, you get remedy in a dispute that you've long wanted to resolve. So that's certainly number one. Another important consideration that made it acceptable to the committee in the drafting stages of the bill, now the Act, was the fact that it had become clear that from the time of the early 80s till recent times, arbitration had become a lot more expensive than was erstwhile conceived it to be. And therefore, the growing cost now became one of the negotiating points that certain big business counterparties were using against smaller business counterparties in negotiating the arbitration agreement. So you were getting certain people insisting on London, Paris, and sometimes even Lagos arbitration, because they knew that the smaller party couldn't afford the process of arbitration. And it meant that many cases were not going to arbitration. So when you come to the lesser reasons of the fact that it will increase the volume in the industry, it'll make arbitration more busy, attractive, it'll make arbitrators more busy and able to generate more income, and therefore the industry grows. They weren't as important as balancing out the equation between otherwise unequal parties because of funds to get to remedy. And third-party funding had increased internationally because of that, because it had become a matter of corporate financing. In fact, that's another reason. Corporate finance had now found that, hang on, this was an interesting business line. If I could calibrate my risk, calculate and do my due diligence for the nature and strength of the claim, I could actually make money from giving the claimant funding in return for a successful claim. So these were the reasons that underpin third-party funding arrangements internationally, and these are the same reasons, and to a large extent even intensely in Nigeria, because we were finding many corporate respondents and claimants unable to push their cases onwards because they were afraid of the cost of arbitration. What will it do? It will bring about an increased volume for sure, because people will now find corporate entities who are able to judge and manage these risks and joint venture with them in pursuing an arbitration claim. Typically, when a third-party funding arrangement is disclosed, it triggers in the minds of the other party, be him respondent or claimant, a need to secure his costs, because a party is normally liable by contract, the contract of arbitration, the agreement to arbitrate, to bear the cost of the winning party, or at least bear his own costs in the event that the tribunal's order is to share costs. And costs are a very important part of the outcome of an arbitral award. So the minute somebody discloses that he has a third-party funder, the first thing it triggers in the minds of the counterparty is, hang on, if there's an adverse order as to cost, does his third-party funding arrangement cover that adverse order to cost order possibility? Because it's easy for them to have agreed how they will share money if they win. It's easy for them to have agreed on how they will share solicitors' fees to bring them to the point of winning. But in the event that they lose and it doesn't have an adverse order cost arrangement for me, the other party, I should be worried. And that's for that reason that the issue of the disclosure in the affidavit is important. Now, any responsible tribunal who thinks that the absence of an obligation to cover adverse order as to cost isn't covered for the non-30-party funding party should be very wary as to allow such a funding arrangement. In fact, it should be a stipulation on the part of that tribunal that it must see evidence that adverse orders as to costs have been taken care of in the third-party funding arrangement. And most tribunals of any recent experience, and certainly operating the AMA, will refuse such an arrangement on the grounds alone that there is no disclosure that adverse orders as to cost will be covered. In fact, it's now getting so bad internationally, not so bad, so good internationally, that it is often asked. So there is a funding party who has a third-party funding arrangement. There is a counterparty who says, I want some security for cost, including adverse orders as to cost. Many tribunals, in my experience, would then say, okay, this is fine. However, you who's asking for security for costs, you must be liable to cover the reasonable cost of posting that security. And so this is trying to equalize parties and to revert them to the situation where they were natural parties without third parties getting involved. So my short answer would be, I think a tribunal would refuse if there's no disclosure and an adverse order as to cost will be covered. Like I've just said, I mean, any responsible tribunal should be guided by the fundamental principles of arbitration, which is to equally treat the parties. You know, we often hear party autonomy, we often hear independence of the parties, we often hear about independence of the arbitral tribunal. But one of the fundamental objectives of arbitration, and therefore duties of the arbitrators and the tribunal members, is to keep the parties equal and to treat them equally, and to use their procedural orders to create that equality. I think that any responsible and experienced tribunal who doesn't cater to that in ensuring that the mere fact that you've got a third-party funder who's interested in profit and is not prepared to take the responsibility of an adverse order would have been failing to the principles of equalizing the parties. So you refer to the Indian decision. I agree with the decision to the extent that it displayed a reticence on the part of the tribunal not to countenance the arrangement because there wasn't an arrangement for third-party costs, an adverse party cost for that matter. The time of asking should have been at the disclosure stage. It's not at the award stage. The time of asking should have been the obligation to disclose. And I must say, right in front of at the beginning, that TPFs require disclosure. Without disclosure, the parties lose equality. I don't think so, and which is not to derogate from the efficacy of what the Singapore or Hong Kong arrangements have produced. I think, first of all, the guidelines will emerge with time. There's a provision in the statute that requires for further regulations and guidelines. But most importantly, we must understand the very nature of arbitral tribunals. Arbitral tribunals can draw on their experience, their expertise, and the general principles of arbitration practice, which actually cover things like disclosure, security for costs, confidentiality, and conflict of interest, which would be the stuff of a regulation or a guideline. So there's nothing wrong under the AMA with an arbitral tribunal making a procedural order requiring those steps to be taken, in spite of the lack of regulations. Now, the regulations put it beyond reproach that they must be considered, and it's highly desirable. But it's almost analogous to the situation where case law can deal and supplant existing statutes until statute comes to meet the situation. So you'll find that arbitration practitioners, experienced tribunals, will ask these questions. And arbitration lawyers, I've been in a situation where we've raised these questions as a result of the disclosure to say, oh, well, if that's the party who's funding you, does his identity not conflict in a way with his ability to act for you in providing funds for this arbitration? So I find a mixture of arbitration practice simpliciter and the tribunal's exercise of procedural powers will supplant the absence of regulations and guidelines in the meantime. And it'll do so effectively because we have, I think in Nigeria, we have a wealth of experience when it comes to international commercial arbitration and indeed international investment arbitration. But without a doubt, the drafters and the promoters of this bill are well aware of the obligation to bring out guidelines and regulations in due course. As one of the proponents of the third-party funding provisions, I'm very well aware that other people are aware that this must be done.
One thing that I also want to bring to the fore is that the new law on the remuneration of lawyers in Nigeria has stated very clearly that when you get a brief, you must enter into terms of engagement with your client. It can be a term of the client of that terms of engagement letter